So now we will begin our look at topic 2.4, transatlantic trade. During the colonial period, an Atlantic economy developed in which goods, as well as enslaved Africans and Native Americans, were exchanged between Europe, Africa, and the Americas through extensive trade networks. The Europeans creating these colonial economies focused on acquiring, producing, and exporting various commodities that were valued in Europe, as well as gaining new sources of labor to produce those commodities. In the colonial era, the Atlantic Ocean would serve as the main connection between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, tying together a very complicated network of people, raw materials, finished goods, merchants, and sailors that brought wealth to the nations possessing those colonial empires. Various goods, such as raw materials, foodstuffs, and textiles, were exchanged. Lumber, furs, fish, whale oil, rice, tobacco, indigo, grain, and even rum were some of the products sent from the English colonies to Europe. Colonies in the West Indies produced sugar, molasses, tobacco, and fruits that were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean as well. In addition, gold and silver from Spanish mining enterprises were enriching high-ranking noblemen and monarchs, allowing them to purchase goods from all around the world. Now, colonies tended to conduct much of their trade with their mother countries because of existing commercial ties, but would trade with anyone, even other colonies, if the opportunity arose. One of the most well-known Atlantic trade systems was that of triangular trade, which emerged as a result of mercantilism, which we'll talk about in a minute. In this system, the Americas would send raw materials to Europe and Africa. Europe would supply Africa and America with finished goods, and Africa would capture and transport slaves to the Americas to produce those goods. The Americans would send lumber, ship parts, iron products, furs, and tobacco to Europe, who in turn would supply the Americas with cloth, iron tools, tea, and furniture. And again, slaves were being transported to the Americas. The West Indies were also a significant part of the trade with Americas, as sugar and molasses were going north to New England to make rum, which was then sent to Europe and Africa to trade for slaves, who went to the West Indies to produce more sugar and molasses so that it could go to New England to produce rum, and the process kept repeating. Colonial food and timber was also sent to Jamaica and other islands who could focus on the profitable sugar industry rather than food and timber. One of the main reasons for the existence of these colonies in the first place was to generate wealth for the mother country, as this was a major motivating factor for the establishment in colonies in the first place. During the colonial era, this economic theory known as mercantilism was developed, which suggested that a nation's power relied on a favorable balance of trade, that is, exporting more than it imported. Okay, basically, this means that mercantilists believed that money, such as gold or silver, was power, and the more gold you accumulated, the more power you had. To get gold, a country had to export more than it imported. In essence, mercantilist country tried to sell as much as possible while buying as little as possible, thus building up their gold reserves. Establishing colonies promoted mercantilist goals in two ways. First, the colonies ensured that the mother country had cheap and reliable supplies of raw materials. And second, they were a captive market for the finished goods that were produced in the mother country. In other words, colonies existed to sell things to the mother country while buying things from it, and the government made its profit by taxing and imposing customs duties on trade. The colonies in North America specialized in producing a variety of commodities that Europeans valued. The islands of the Caribbean produced sugar, Carolina produced rice and indigo, which was a deep, dark blue dye. The Chesapeake produced tobacco, the middle colonies produced foodstuffs like grain. With the shorter growing seasons, New England colonies couldn't produce cash crops, but instead they had abundant forests to build ships for fishing, which they also did, as well as, building ships for carrying a variety of cargo across the Atlantic. The northern forests were also home to various fur-producing animals like beaver, whose pelts were particularly prized. To maximize the benefits of this mercantilist system, Britain had to ensure that only they would be getting the benefits of this colonial trade. In 1651, Parliament passed the first of the Navigation Acts, which aimed to control trade between Britain and the colonies. The Act specified that enumerated, or goods on a specified list, which were the most valuable commodities, like sugar and tobacco, had to be transported on British ships, manned with British sailors, and sold in British ports. That way, the British Crown could reap the customs duties on the imported goods, and British merchants and shipbuilders could profit from that business. Now, when it came to sailors, they could be either British or American, because if you were American, you were still British. However, many of the colonies, most of them in fact, despised mercantilism in principle because it didn't allow them the economic freedom to produce what they wanted and to sell it to any country they wanted. Now, the South produced rice, cotton, and tobacco, all of which were products Britain needed, which in turn actually created some colonial jealousy with New England, particularly jealous of this favoritism. Southerners often despised Britain because Britain controlled prices and therefore the products that Southerners had available to purchase. Some of them wanted to buy things from France or Spain, and that wasn't allowed under mercantilism. The Navigation Acts, however, were only sporadically enforced, partly due to frequent changes in the British government and Britain's involvement in a variety of European wars. So this created an extended period, particularly between the 1720s and 1760s, when British officials overlooked colonist violations of the Navigation Acts. They just went and traded with whoever they wanted anyway. Besides, the coastline is so darn large, enforcement would be difficult at best. Now, this time period also happened to coincide with the reigns of King George I and George II, the so-called Hanoverian kings, who were often more interested in what was going on the continent rather than what was going on in England itself. But after the death of George II in 1760, his grandson, George III, took over, and he had been born and raised in England and had actually never set foot in Hanover, so he was determined not just to reign over his territories, but to actually rule them, since he cared more about England than he did about Hanover, though he was still technically its ruler. Now, to pay for his wars in Europe, he attempted to reassert control over colonial trade, but the colonists rebelled, ultimately starting the American Revolution, which we'll get to in the next unit. In addition, though, to the economic salutary neglect, the British colonies had also developed quite a long tradition of self-rule, dating from the establishment of the Virginia House of Burgesses back in 1619 and the signing of the Mayflower Compact in 1620. Any interference with this tradition would be met with significant resistance, again, which ultimately led to the American Revolution.